Welcome back. We've got the first week in the bag here, so that should feel pretty good. Today, I want to talk about how poems move. Okay, the movement of a poem, how we as poets get from the first line to the last line, what happens in between, and how that really generates the main dynamics of the poem. Okay, this idea of movement. Um, you are going to be reading an essay by the poet Richard Hugo, who was one of the great teachers of poetry. Okay, he wrote this book called The Triggering Town, um, and it's become sort of a manual for creative writing instructors. And just he comes up with fantastic ways of explaining what happens in a poem. And getting students to kind of very quickly think like real poets. It's very cool, very cool. So you're going to be reading one of the most well-known essays from that book, called what is it? Writing off the subject. Writing off the subject. Okay. And I would like you to read it very closely because I think it's a very useful essay. And he does incidentally make a point at the beginning of this essay, which I would like to echo, which is that he's throwing a lot of theories at you. I'm going to be throwing a lot of concepts and theories at you, right? But you don't have to listen to me, right? One of the great things about poetry is that we don't have rules, right? We have as a tradition. Okay, we have a tradition. We have tons and tons and tons of poems that have been written in certain ways. But the way that tradition stays alive is that people break those rules, right? Break that tradition, deviate from that tradition. Okay, so it's almost like Fight Club. It's like there are no rules. That's the first rule of poetry. Um, that said, we all have the responsibility, as students, to think critically about all of the tradition, all of the concept, all of the essays and theories that are presented to us, right? So the prerequisite of being able to break the rules, you have to know the rules first, okay? A jazz musician, right, has to know how to play classical music, right? Has to know the scales and has to practice the scales in order to bust them open, right? So it's sort of the same thing with poetry, right? You kind of have to know what Hugo is talking about, and then you can say, well, screw that, I'm going to do this instead, right? Okay. All that aside, right? Richard Hugo writes this essay in which he presents the idea of two different subjects for the poem. Okay, so at the bottom of the first page, he says a poem can be said to have two subjects: the initiating or triggering subject, and this is what starts the poem or causes the poem to be written. Okay, this is often a concrete thing, right? He gives the example of autumn rain, right? Rain in the fall, or in the case of Elizabeth Bishop, right? The poem we read, it would be the filling station, right? A gas station. Okay, so that's just the concrete thing that begins the poem, oftentimes an image, right? And then there is the real or generated subject, okay, which the poem comes to say or mean, and which is generated or discovered in the poem during the writing. All right. This happens in the poem itself. We move from the triggering to the real subject. Okay. This is sort of another way of saying, and I hope you can see this. This is sort of another way of articulating the difference between the concrete and the abstract. What we talked about on Wednesday, right? Triggering subject, often an image of the concrete world, something that gets us going, right? And then the real subject is something you find out, right? Something that is a lot more difficult to articulate, oftentimes an abstract concept that we can't really put into words, right? We can't paraphrase, okay? In much the same way that we don't exactly know what Bishop is talking about when she says somebody loves us all, right? Well, what does she mean by somebody? What does she mean by love? Who is all? Yeah, who is the us referring to here, right? But we feel it. That's one of the great things about poetry. We can kind of escape paraphrase in that way, okay? The triggering subject and then the real subject, the concrete versus the abstract, all right? And one of the most important things to keep in mind here is that oftentimes poets will not know where they're going, okay? We might say that in the best poems, the poet does not know where they're going, right? So they begin with a pretty clear triggering subject, okay? But then the real subject, they don't have that in mind before they begin, right? They discover it through the process of writing, okay? Bishop probably didn't know she was going to write that last line, okay? But she did. All right. She started describing a gas station, and the gas station, the details, the concrete triggering details of the gas station, pulled the trigger for her and led her to her real subject here. Okay, very cool, very interesting. Another way of articulating this is the way Robert Frost put it. Okay, he says, "No surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader." All right. If you're not surprised in the writing of your poem, then you can bet that your reader will not be surprised. Okay, and readers of poetry love surprise. That's why we go to it, right? To see the world differently, right? But if you're not seeing the world differently in the writing of your own poem, if you're beginning with received truths, with truths that you already know, as Hugo says, then why write the poem? You already know. You already know it. The poem is a tool for learning, for seeing the world differently, for discovering, for expedition. Okay. This is all to say that we begin somewhere in a poem and we end somewhere else. All right. And oftentimes we don't know how we got there. Okay. I had a teacher once. Very very early on, as soon as I began writing poems, I had this teacher, and I came to him one day in his office hours, and I said, "Oh, Mr. Weigel, name was Weigel, I have this great idea for a poem that I wanted to share with you." And he stopped. He says, "You have an idea for a poem?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry. That's too bad." Right? And he was making the point that, well, if you already know your real subject, sorry, man, that's the whole game, right? Poems are supposed to get you from here to here. If you already know where you're going to end up, why go there? Okay. Again, as Hugo says, this is one theory. Feel free to break it open if you want. Okay. But I do think that the notion of discovery is very important, right? Begin with a stirring image in your poems and see where that leads you. Okay. Now, I want to make the point that some of this can feel a little airy-fairy, a little kind of soft, a little, unknowable in a way, right? We're talking about, this is a college class, right? And we're talking about how we don't really know what we're writing about, right? How we sort of discover it in the process, right? Which is kind of a little ridiculous, maybe. But it's not, because this is how the human mind works, right? Every poem is simply the speaker of the poem thinking through something on the page, right? And we think by association, which is exactly what this is. You begin with the triggering subject, and you kind of associate your way in a chain to the real subject. Okay? That's exactly how the human mind works. So, for instance, on my desk here is a camera, right? And I look at that camera. That's my triggering subject, and then I think about this time that I was taking pictures on the beach with some friends. This thing happened, probably 10 years ago. Okay, so I think of that, and then I think of one of the friends that was there, who I haven't seen in a long time, but who I've heard her mom is in and out of the hospital. She's not doing well, right? So I think of that, and then I think of this this woman, her mom, sort of during the summers, she would serve us Kool-Aid in these little Dixie cups, with like Disney characters on them, So here, in just that quick chain of events, something that can happen really in the span of 0 seconds, it just all of a sudden you're there. I move from the camera to a little Disney princess on a Kool-Aid cup, right? A little Dixie cup, and that's what happens in the poem, right? We slow down the movement of the mind, and we trace what the mind is doing, and there's great emotion in that, right? So the triggering subject of that poem is the camera on my desk, which triggers a memory, right? But the real subject is probably, if the poem was written, probably something about friendship, or illness, or grief, or childhood, or memory, or something like that. Something that's much harder to articulate, but that has to do with the triggering subject. Okay, surprise. We want to move from the known to the unknown. All right, and we have to figure this out for ourselves. How association comes into play in our poems. But at base, that is how poems move. Okay, we begin with something, and we end up with something else, and the mind is going to take us there. The mind is going to associate things in order to get us there. All right. There are other models, there are other ways that tradition has taught us that poems can be written. Okay, today you're going to read a poem by great poet Frank O'Hara, right? It's called "The Day Lady Died," and it refers to the day that Billie Holiday, the great singer, died. O'Hara writes these poems called, well, people have called them sort of "I do this, I do that" poems, right? In that they move not necessarily by association, but sort of by strict narrative. You know, I do this, I do that. I wake up one day, I buy a sandwich, and then I go and I talk to my one friend, and then I go have coffee with my other friend. Then I go to work, etc., etc., etc. Right? So the poem is less by association and more by story, by narrative. This is what happens. This is what happens. This is what happens. But even in that case, right? When we're working with narrative, right? When we're working on the story temperament, okay, as Gregory Orr would say, we still end up with a real subject that is very different from the triggering subject, which is a sort of a diary-like recounting of the day, right? And you'll see that when you read the end of the poem. It's about much more than what Frank O'Hara, the poet, was doing on the day that he learned that Billie Holiday had died. In the last line or so, you realize, wow, this poem is about something much more difficult to articulate and much more important. Okay, so that's my spiel for today. 2 points here: difference between the triggering subject and the real subject. Keep that in mind when you're writing your poems. Okay, and this idea of association. Okay, and we're going to get better at how to free associate in our poems, right? And how to kind of liberate our minds so that we're allowing ourselves to kind of follow all the different little pathways that the mind is going to take us on. Okay, but keep in mind how important the movement of association is. No surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. Okay. Incidentally, Frost also said the corollary of that was no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. Okay, and maybe we'll talk about that a little later, right? But the idea that in order to have an emotional impact on a reader, man, the poet better feel something too, right? Which is probably obvious to us. Okay, so today your poems are due. Your first poem. Okay, and again, I want to make the point that I'm really only going to be looking for concrete imagery and metaphor and simile in this particular poem. Please read the rubric that is attached to the poem assignment, right? Please read that very carefully, okay? That'll give you some more specific directions. But basically, I just want you to sort of have fun, experiment with what this strange thing called a poem is, and pay attention to concrete imagery and metaphor and simile, okay? If you do that, you'll score well, no worries. Please submit these poems tonight, okay? You're going to submit them to the spot on Blackboard that says, submit your poems here, right? Very clearly there, into the assignment, or the poem number 1 category, right? But then you're also, and this is very important, going to post the drafts to Blackboard, okay? I'm sorry, to the discussion page on Blackboard, just as you did in the fiction unit. And this way, your peers will be able to comment on the poems by next Tuesday, okay? You're all going to have to provide a critique of 2 poems by next Tuesday, okay? Today you also have where you're going to do the reading with the Frank O'Hara poem, etc. You're going to read the Richard Hugo essay. You're going to have another assignment to do in addition to these readings. Okay, so some stuff to do today, but then you can take the weekend off. Okay, great. Please let me know if you have any questions about the poems or about anything. All right, thanks, guys. Have a good